After the First World War, the climate in Germany was one of strife. Tensions in foreign relations, economic woes, every political orientation fought the others. For the liberals, all of those were minor battles. They were occupied with struggling among themselves. Actually, for the liberals, the time of the Weimar Republic began with the unifying moment. This fact is quite shocking because just before the outbreak of the Great War, the German liberals were in crisis. While the liberal factions had received around 40% of the votes in the first federal election in the newly found German Empire, in 1912 they had shrunken to 26.5%. This share of votes was nearly equally distributed between two liberal parties, the Nationalliberale Partei, National Liberal Party, and the Fortschrittliche Volkspartei, Progressive People's Party. Coming out of the Great War, the liberals were fully aware that the specter of socialism was looming menacingly over Germany. The two parties realized they had to unite in order to face it. The attempt started in November 1918, when the chairman of the FVB, Otto Fischbeck, called for a unification of the liberal parties. Soon, the DDP, the Deutsche Demokratische Partei, German Democratic Party, was founded, no relations to the DDR, and former FVB members joined in mass. Major players in the DDP were Theodor Wolff and Alfred Weber. Another well-known name connected to this party is Hjalmar Schacht. One of the predecessors of the DDP was Eugen Richter, a politician who wrote the most prophetic book I have ever read. You can learn more about it by clicking this link. While negotiations for a merger with the NLP began, this party recreated itself as the DVP, the Deutsche Volkspartei, German People's Party. One person is enough to represent the DVP, and that is Gustav Stresemann, of whom we will hear more throughout this video. The start of the negotiations was promising, but when the left-wing Alfred Weber of the DDP weighed in, they suffered setbacks. He was too socialistic even for the party's left wing. Years later, he would even become a member of the SPD. The dream of a unified liberal party died after just 5 weeks of negotiations. When Weber was not willing to relax his positions, the left-wing DDP leadership rejected the right-wing DVP's demands, and Stresemann felt unable to join the DDP. A major point was that the extreme left in the DDP did not trust Stresemann. The leaders of the DDP saw him as compromised due to his support for the war effort. He had been well known for advocating a policy of annexion during the war, which aimed at incorporating land in the West and the East into Germany. That being said, history shows that the Great War led to Stresemann's disillusionment. It was the DDP which was the winner of the failed unification. During the negotiations, big chunks of the DVP's elements in southern Germany, Silesia and Saxony went over to the left-wingers. To make matters worse, the DVP lost most of their money and donors. With 4 weeks left until the first election of the Weimar Republic, Stresemann began to rebuild his party on the basis of the remaining structure in Hanover. The results of this could be seen at the polls. While in the last election of 1912, the predecessors of both parties got around 13% each, in 1919 the left-wing DDP reached impressive 18.6% and the right-wing DVP 4.4%. To achieve this, the DVP had to join its list with other parties, a peculiarity of the Weimar election system, in every single district. Speaking of left and right, what were the parties' positions and where were the differences? The left-wing DDP ran under the slogan "Forward and upwards in Germany and for Germany." The right-wing DVP slogan was "Unity and right and liberty are the pledge of happiness." A part of the Deutschlandlied, the national anthem of today's and Weimar's Germany. These condensed descriptions already tell us a lot about the party's worldviews. But let's paint a clearer picture by taking a closer look at the programs. Both programs start with describing the relation to the Weimar system. Here we find the first differences. While the DDP formulates its position as follows: the party stands on the ground of the Weimar Constitution. To her protection and execution she is called. The DVP sees Weimar this way. The DVP encourages the recreation of the Reich by all means. Therefore, she will collaborate inside the current form of government within her political principles. Not exactly enthusiastic, if you ask me. Their skepticism towards the Republic also shows in the party's demand for the return of the imperial flag. In short, while the left-wingers embraced democracy and the new republic, the right-wingers were constitutional monarchists who saw the new institutions just as an annoyance they had to deal with. Regarding domestic policy, they took the following positions. Both parties see the citizen as duty-bound to the state. All citizens, male or female, enjoy the same rights. The constituent states of the Republic should be organized in a federative system, each governing itself as independently as possible. The DDP adds here that they wish for a state bureaucracy staffed by permanent civil servants. The DVP urges that Prussia, the by far most dominant state in Germany, taking around half of its territory, must not be split up. The DDP describes the professional soldiery of Germany as mercenaries and wants to replace them by conscripts. The DVP makes no mentions in this regard. But they add that they oppose the influx of foreigners into the country. Nearly a third of the DDP's program is about culture and education, which is a testament to the large number of artists, teachers and scientists in the ranks. They want to school every child in comprehensive schools for free. Schools and teachers are monopolized by the state in order to raise moral citizens, but also to protect minority views. Everyone owes the fruits of his education to the people. The DVP statement on these issues is much shorter. In contrast, the DVP sees the main purpose of education to further the German state. For this purpose, they accept private schooling. While the DDP wants to advance the separation of church and state, the DVP wants to free the churches from the influence of the state. They will keep the right to tax the community. Next, there's foreign policy. Here, both parties mostly agree that all German lands must be united. The DVP explicitly adds that German minorities in other countries must be protected just as much as minorities inside Germany. Germany must regain its former colonies. For both parties, the treaties of Versailles and Saint-Germain are bad. Germany should strive towards international reconciliation. The DVP adds that this is not possible while the violent peace, Versailles, is kept. The DVP actually left the government coalition in 1919 when the Treaty of Versailles was signed. However, they returned only months later with the tail between their legs. Then there are economic issues. Both parties reject the nationalization of the economy as harmful for the welfare of the people. The DDP is much more activistic on economic issues. They call for self-responsibility and individual responsibility, but see the common good as the supreme aim to reach social justice. They want to use the tax system to equalize the distribution of wealth and provide a social safety net. They want to break up or even nationalize monopolies, especially if those are about land. They also think that working with machines steals the soul of the workers. This must be counteracted by equalizing employer and employee. In contrast, the DVP thinks that the social question cannot be solved through economic means, but only through the inner equality of the compatriots. Conflicts between the classes are to be solved by arbitration. This was well in the tradition of the former NLP, for which the primacy of the foreign policy was the rule. Especially Stresemann saw economic issues as a tool to support the international power of the state only. Trying to put these programs into a modern perspective is an interesting attempt. It is hard to categorize the stuff about the Treaty of Versailles and the colonies into today's political context. However, in the program it becomes clear that the DDP was more left-wing, while the DVP might have been right of center. From today's perspective, the DDP is a moderate social democratic party, as you can see with the positions regarding education and all the talk about social justice, which can easily be used to justify interventions. This description would not have been apt 100 years ago, when the SPD itself was much more radical than after the Second World War. Today's best comparison is the liberal FDP in Germany. The modern German parties all have a dominant social democratic element. In today's Germany, the only relevant party that stands for some nationalism is the AfD. And no, that does not necessarily mean that they are Nazis. The AfD covers a very broad political spectrum and is probably the best, although very imperfect modern comparison to the DVP. Maybe you scream right now and want to contradict me, so please feel free to tell me off in the comments. The political programs also show in the party's constituents. Both liberal parties were unable to appeal to skilled workers. The conservatives already occupied the small and middle entrepreneurs and farmers. These parties also shared the white-collar voters with the SPD. In the DDP, high finance and trade took control. Their donors brought an imbalance to the party's finances, which made it hard to appeal to the middle and working class. During election seasons, 90% of the DDP's finances came from big business. The DVP was called the party of the Schlottbarone, the chimney barons, referring to the industrialists who, at the side of academics, took a significant position of the party's seats in the Reichstag. But the financial elite is too small to provide a voter pool. So where did the bulk of the voters come from? In the literature, we very often find the word Honoratiorenpartei to describe the liberals. This means the party of the notables, and describes locally important people who occupy positions in the state's bureaucracy, consisting of middle and lower level civil servants, artists and scientists. Both liberal parties were represented in nearly every cabinet during the Weimar Republic. The DDP first entered into a government coalition in February 1919, right after the first election. They had at least one minister in every cabinet until the start of the von Papen cabinet in May 1932. The same held for the DVP. Stresemann was foreign minister from 1923 until his death in 1929. Only the conservative Zentrum, which never left government responsibilities until the very end, reigned longer. The liberals' participation in the government brought them many challenges. Early on, the Republic was shaken by strikes and revolts in the east and the west, from both political sides. Politically, this did not hurt the liberals. Although the DDP experienced massive losses in the election of 1920, the DVP gained roughly as much. However, the following years brought further strife. Unsurprisingly, it originated in foreign policy, especially questions about the reparations. These easily turned into domestic issues. In 1922, tensions with the victorious powers in the Great War reached a new high. Britain and in particular France demanded new taxes to pay for reparations. This led to the Conference of Genoa, but not to any results. Instead, the DDP foreign minister Rathenau created a treaty that normalized the relationship with the Soviet Union in the Repeller Agreement, thereby securing Germany's back, but angering the former Entente. The DVP minister Stresemann supported this action. The consequences were harsh, and what followed was even harsher. The occupation of the Ruhr by French and Belgian forces in January of 1923 was a direct reaction to the treaty with the Soviets. In this situation, the German government and with it the enthusiastic DDP decided on passive resistance. Long story short, the German government called for strikes against the occupiers and printed large amounts of banknotes to finance those. What happens when one increases the quantity of money? Right, inflation. In this case, even hyperinflation. In the ensuing chaos, the DVP managed to make Stresemann Chancellor for 109 days between the 13th of August and the 3rd of October 1923. In these 3 months, he needed 2 cabinets, and the very well-known Hjalmar Schacht became president of the Reichsbank. The paper mark was abolished and replaced with the Reichsmark. Before that, the Dawes Plan with the Western powers went into effect. This treaty aimed at enabling Germany to pay its reparations on a sustainable basis. At the same time, communists rose in Saxony and Thuringia, while in Munich, Hitler decided to march on the beer halls. This meant martial law. Behind Stresemann's back, industrial magnates of his own party tried to use these emergency measures to get rid of the Republic, thereby showing the anti-republican sentiment in large parts of the bourgeoisie. Since the SPD saw a difference in treatment between the communist and Nazi rebels, she left the coalition and Stresemann returned to being foreign minister. He would remain in this position until his death in 1929. We need to discuss the influence of the liberals up to this point. Both parties supported the political agenda that led to the occupation of the Ruhr. In fact, their ministers participated in the creation of the Ruhr crisis. But they also took part in resolving it. Stresemann's reign as Chancellor was short, but getting rid of hyperinflation alone and introducing a relatively stable currency is an important achievement. Give fault where fault is due, and credit where credit is due. Which stance did the voters take in face of the crisis? In the first election of 1924, both parties lost massively. In fact, all parties, except for the communists and the conservatives, lost. In the next election of the same year, they recovered slightly. Summed up, they lost 1/3 of the vote, mostly to the DNVP. In the 1925 election for president, the split between the two liberal parties showed again. The DVP presented Karl Jahres and gained the DNVP's support for him, thereby putting him into the top spot in the election with nearly 39%, although it was not enough to win. Helpach, the DDP's candidate, delivered a sobering result with only 6%. On the second ballot, the DDP joined with the SPD and the Zentrum to support the conservative Marx. The DVP threw in the lot with Hindenburg, who would go on and become the first and only German president elected by popular vote. As foreign minister, the DVP's Stresemann worked on improving the relationship with France. In 1926, the Italians and British guaranteed the border between Germany and France to prevent another invasion like in 1914 or 1923. This treaty meant that the western border was fixed and Alsace-Lorraine was lost for good. Of course, although necessary as we have seen with the Ruhr crisis, this was an unpopular diplomatic move. The next election brought losses for the DNVP and gains for the SPD. Both liberal parties lost moderately. They managed to keep relevant numbers. In 1929, the Dawes Plan was changed into the Young Plan, which stretched the reparations until 1988 and made the last French forces leave the Rhineland. Stresemann's foreign policy aimed at re-establishing Germany as a great power through economic means. He relied heavily on cooperation with the US as the final creditor of Europe. He rejected all attempts from inside Germany to return to power politics. As you can imagine, he had to face a lot of criticism. And then, on the 3rd of October 1929, the unthinkable happened. Gustav Stresemann, who more than anyone else was the face of the DVP and thereby of German liberalism, died. Under him, the DVP, although originally monarchist and not exactly happy about the Weimar Republic, had turned more and more into a defender of the new republican state. The emphasis here lies not on republican, but on state. Stresemann did not love the Republic, but it was his conviction that the German state had to survive. With the death of Stresemann, the DVP now was full in the hands of industrialists, who put more and more emphasis on the national community, which the party upheld in its original program. They also ended Stresemann's dovish foreign policy and intended to end his deal of Locarno, which fixed the western border. Stresemann's death could not have been timed worse for the party. In the same month, Wall Street crashed, and the golden 20s came to an abrupt end. It seems times without crisis were short in Germany. The liberal parties supported the reforms of Chancellor Brüning, which included pay cuts for civil servants. This hit exactly the liberal electorate and may explain the immense losses in the next election. The economic hardships cost the coalition dearly. The results of the 1930 elections were appalling for the liberals. The DDP lost a quarter of the votes and the DVP, probably due to Stresemann's death, nearly halved. Many voters left for the NSDAP. A new liberal faction split from the DDP. It called itself the Volksnationale Reichsvereinigung, which is hard to translate without losing the meaning. The People's National Union of the Reich. This cost the DDP 6 of the 20 members of parliament. The DDP used the occasion to rebrand itself as the Deutsche Staatspartei, the German state party, which might also have been the intention of the late Stresemann. While in 1919 unification had been a serious attempt, in 1930 it was dead from the start. Programmatically, the liberals became more nationalist and rejected the treaties with the victorious powers of the Great War. This was an attempt to garner disillusioned Nazis and gather the middle class in a unified liberal party to prevent radicalization. The situation was so dire that in the election of 32, the DVP had to combine their candidate lists with the DNVP to gain some seats at all. They actually went so far as to seriously consider doing the same thing with the NSDAP. The renewed DSDP remained independent at first, but in March 1933 they also joined lists. First, the Zentrum refused them, but the Social Democrats, in a desperate situation themselves, accepted. This strategy did not save either of the liberal parties, nor any of the others. After continuous losses over the last 10 years, the liberal parties vanished into oblivion. In the July election of 1932, the DVP reached only 1.2% and the DDP 1%. Politically annihilated, the liberals found their end just like all the other parties did, by the massive victory by the NSDAP in 1933, when Hitler had become Chancellor. Shortly after the election, the Enabling Act of 1933 passed through Parliament. The 5 members of Parliament of the Staatspartei held a vote. 3 decided to accept Hitler's proposal, and the other 2 followed the majority. They issued the following statement: "In the interest of the people and the fatherland, and in expectation of a development according to law, we will put aside our serious considerations and consent to the Ermächtigungsgesetz." The members of the DVP voted with them. With this, Weimar was history, and so were the parties. Hitler's message was clear. There was no guarantee that members of other parties would not be persecuted unless they dissolved. According to Hans Booms, being a member of another party would never be the official reason for a removal from office. Instead, the reason was formulated as hateful attitude towards the National Socialist movement. Together with the SPD, the DSDP was the first to dissolve. They declared this in 2 sober sentences. DNVP and Zentrum followed. So did the DVP on the 29th of June 1933. Party leader Dingeldey did so without asking the members to switch to the NSDAP. He closed his declaration with the party slogan: "Unity and right and liberty are the pledge of happiness." Together with the conservative Zentrum and the occasional support of the SPD, it was the liberals who created the coalition that supported the Republic, sometimes even against their own biases. They were a main pillar on which German democracy rested. As the parties crumbled, so did the political institutions. Or was it the other way round? In the end, it might have been a negative feedback loop. Once being a major political power in all of Germany, the liberals found their demise in Germany's first democratic experiment. After the war, the liberals would only exist on the political sidelines. To assure full transparency, I should add a comment. The political position which describes my own the best probably is classical liberal. However, I reject almost every single point in the DVP's and the DDP's political programs. On civil liberties, they are too collectivistic. On foreign policy and economic issues, they are too interventionist. Maybe I'm closer to them when it comes to real politics, and therefore I may have some sympathy for them, but in the end, we are too far apart. Maybe I should find another word than liberal. Doesn't that represent the liberal split perfectly? We will meet again soon and put what we learned to good use by finding out from which parties the NSDAP drew its votes. Until then, stay critical, stay curious, stay free.